The Situation Room at the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia carried an atmosphere of tense anticipation in late May 1942 as Adolf Hitler convened a special military conference to brief senior Wehrmacht commanders about the strategic situation developing in North Africa, where British forces under a relatively unknown general named Bernard Law Montgomery were being positioned to take command of Eighth Army following the series of defeats that had brought Axis forces to within striking distance of Cairo and the Suez Canal. A development that Hitler's intelligence services had been monitoring closely and that the Führer had concluded represented a potential turning point in the Desert Campaign that required German forces to prepare for facing an enemy commander whose capabilities and command style differed significantly from the British generals who had previously opposed Rommel's Afrika Korps. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had achieved remarkable successes against British forces through bold operational maneuvers and exploitation of British command weaknesses, was not present at this conference as he remained in North Africa preparing for what would become the First Battle of El Alamein. But his reports about British command changes and about indications that new British leadership might adopt different tactical approaches had prompted Hitler to analyze what was known about Montgomery and to communicate his assessment to German commanders who would be responsible for operations in theaters where British forces operated. As Hitler spread intelligence documents and photographs across the conference table, pointing to Montgomery's career history and to assessments of his personality and command philosophy compiled by German intelligence services, he delivered a warning that would prove remarkably prescient, even though it would be largely ignored by commanders who had grown accustomed to dismissing British military capabilities. Montgomery was different from previous British commanders, possessed a systematic approach to warfare that emphasized careful preparation and overwhelming material superiority rather than operational brilliance, would not be goaded into premature attacks through tactical provocations, and represented exactly the kind of methodical professional commander who could exploit British advantages in resources and industrial capacity to defeat German forces through attrition rather than through the kind of mobile warfare where German tactical excellence had previously proven decisive, making him a far more dangerous opponent than the cavalier British generals who had allowed Rommel to achieve stunning victories through aggressive maneuver and exploitation of British mistakes. Hitler's warning about Montgomery emerged from intelligence assessments that German military intelligence services had compiled about British command changes and about the officer who would assume command of Eighth Army, assessments that painted a picture of a professional soldier whose career had been characterized by meticulous attention to detail, by emphasis on thorough training and preparation, by insistence on overwhelming superiority before launching attacks, and by a command style that prioritized minimizing casualties over achieving rapid operational success. The intelligence reports noted that Montgomery had served in World War I, where he had been severely wounded at the First Battle of Ypres in October 1914 when he was shot through the lung by a sniper, an experience that nearly killed him and that required months of recovery, and where he had witnessed firsthand the catastrophic casualties that resulted from poorly planned attacks against prepared defenses during battles like the Somme, where British forces suffered 60,000 casualties on the first day alone in exchange for minimal territorial gains. These experiences had shaped Montgomery's conviction that battles should not be fought unless success was virtually assured through adequate preparation and overwhelming force, and that commanders bore moral responsibility for the soldiers under their command. That required minimizing casualties through professional competence and thorough planning rather than achieving rapid success through aggressive action that produced heavy losses. His interwar career had involved various staff and training assignments, including positions at Staff College, where he taught military theory and doctrine, at the War Office, where he worked on force modernization, and in various field commands, where he had developed a reputation as a demanding commander who insisted on high standards of training and readiness, and who was willing to relieve subordinates who failed to meet his expectations. The intelligence reports documented incidents where Montgomery had clashed with superiors over training methods, where he had relieved officers he considered incompetent regardless of their seniority or connections, and where his abrasive personality and his unwillingness to compromise on professional standards had made him unpopular with some colleagues, even as his competence was widely recognized. These characteristics painted a picture of an officer who valued professional effectiveness over popularity, who was confident in his own judgment to the point of arrogance, and who would not be influenced by political considerations or by pressure from superiors to deviate from approaches he considered professionally sound. The assessments that Hitler reviewed with his commanders emphasized several characteristics that made Montgomery different from previous British commanders and that made him a potentially more dangerous opponent for German forces. Montgomery would not be rushed into attacks before his forces were fully prepared, meaning that German tactical provocations that had previously goaded British commanders into premature offensives would not work against him, and that German forces would face British attacks only when British preparations were complete and when Montgomery assessed that success was probable. The previous British commanders in North Africa, including General Neil Ritchie and General Claude Auchinleck, had sometimes allowed themselves to be pressured into launching attacks before preparations were complete, either through political pressure from Churchill demanding action, or through tactical provocations from Rommel that suggested vulnerabilities that needed to be exploited quickly, creating situations where British attacks were launched with inadequate preparation and where German forces could defeat British offensives through tactical excellence that exploited British mistakes and coordination failures. Montgomery would insist on material superiority before attacking, meaning that battles would be fought under conditions where British advantages in tanks, artillery, aircraft, and supplies would be maximized, and where German forces would face enemies possessing overwhelming material advantages that would be difficult to counter through tactical excellence alone. The intelligence assessments noted that Montgomery's command philosophy emphasized building up force ratios that made success virtually certain before committing forces to battle, typically insisting on superiority of 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 in tanks and artillery before launching major offensives, and on complete air superiority that would allow British air forces to support ground operations while preventing German air forces from interfering with British movements. This approach reflected an understanding that British industrial capacity and imperial resources could provide overwhelming material superiority if given adequate time to accumulate forces and supplies, making patience in preparation a strategic advantage rather than a weakness. Montgomery would emphasize systematic planning and coordination rather than improvisation, meaning that British attacks would be carefully orchestrated according to detailed plans that specified objectives for each phase of operations, that allocated forces and supplies according to planned requirements, and that coordinated infantry, armor, artillery, and air support according to predetermined schedules, rather than relying on commanders at various levels to improvise based on tactical opportunities. This systematic approach created both strengths in terms of coordination and ensuring that all elements of British forces operated according to a unified concept, and potential vulnerabilities if plans could be disrupted or if tactical situations developed that were not anticipated in planning and that required flexible response rather than adherence to predetermined plans. But most significantly, the assessments that Hitler reviewed with his commanders emphasized several characteristics that made Montgomery different from previous British commanders and that made him a potentially more dangerous opponent for German forces. Montgomery would not be rushed into attacks before his forces were fully prepared, meaning that German tactical provocations that had previously goaded British commanders into premature offensives would not work against him, and that German forces would face British attacks only when British preparations were complete and when Montgomery assessed that success was probable.
The previous British commanders in North Africa, including General Neil Ritchie and General Claude Auchinleck, had sometimes allowed themselves to be pressured into launching attacks before preparations were complete, either through political pressure from Churchill demanding action, or through tactical provocations from Rommel that suggested vulnerabilities that needed to be exploited quickly, creating situations where British attacks were launched with inadequate preparation and where German forces could defeat British offensives through tactical excellence that exploited British mistakes and coordination failures. Montgomery would insist on material superiority before attacking, meaning that battles would be fought under conditions where British advantages in tanks, artillery, aircraft, and supplies would be maximized, and where German forces would face enemies possessing overwhelming material advantages that would be difficult to counter through tactical excellence alone. The intelligence assessments noted that Montgomery's command philosophy emphasized building up force ratios that made success virtually certain before committing forces to battle, typically insisting on superiority of 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 in tanks and artillery before launching major offensives, and on complete air superiority that would allow British.
These characteristics meant that Montgomery represented a strategic approach to defeating Germany rather than merely a tactical challenge, and that facing Montgomery successfully would require different approaches than those that had worked against previous British commanders who had been more willing to take risks and who had been more vulnerable to German tactical excellence exploiting British mistakes. Hitler's analysis of Montgomery drew on his broader understanding of how British strategic culture and British imperial position shaped British military operations, and his warning to German commanders reflected recognition that Montgomery embodied the British approach to warfare in ways that made him a particularly formidable opponent for reasons that transcended individual tactical competence or operational brilliance. The Führer emphasized that British commanders operated within a political and strategic context that made minimizing casualties essential in ways that did not apply to totalitarian regimes that could compel sacrifice regardless of popular sentiment, or to nations fighting for immediate survival on their own territory, where high casualties would be accepted as a necessary price for preventing defeat. Britain's relatively small population compared to Germany or to other major powers meant that heavy casualties were politically unsustainable and could undermine public support for the war effort, particularly when casualties occurred in operations that did not produce commensurate results or that appeared to result from poor planning or command incompetence. The memory of World War I casualties that had devastated a generation of British men and that remained vivid in British national consciousness meant that British public opinion would not support commanders who achieved victories through methods that produced casualty levels comparable to the Somme or Passchendaele, where hundreds of thousands of British soldiers had died in battles that achieved minimal territorial gains and that had come to symbolize feudal sacrifice resulting from incompetent generalship. This created a political constraint on British commanders that did not apply to German commanders operating under the Nazi totalitarian system or to Soviet commanders operating under the Stalinist system, where casualties could be accepted at levels that would be politically impossible in democratic nations, making British emphasis on minimizing casualties through careful preparation not weakness or timidity, but a rational response to political realities that shaped what British commanders could accomplish while maintaining public support. Britain's imperial commitments that required forces to be maintained in multiple theaters, from India to the Middle East to Africa to various garrison duties throughout the empire, meant that forces lost in one theater could not easily be replaced without weakening Britain's position elsewhere, or without relying increasingly on imperial forces from Australia, New Zealand, India, and other dominions whose political leaders were becoming more resistant to providing forces for British strategic priorities that did not directly affect their own security. This created additional pressure on British commanders to achieve objectives with acceptable casualties and to preserve forces for future operations rather than accepting heavy losses in pursuit of rapid success or ambitious objectives, reinforcing Montgomery's emphasis on systematic preparation and overwhelming force as an approach that would achieve British strategic goals while maintaining force levels necessary for Britain's global commitments. Montgomery's emphasis on thorough preparation and overwhelming force before attacking was not timidity or lack of aggressive spirit, Hitler argued, but was rather a rational approach to warfare, given the constraints and advantages that characterized the British strategic position. By insisting on material superiority before attacking, Montgomery would be exploiting Britain's industrial capacity and imperial resources to create conditions where British forces would prevail through weight of numbers and firepower, rather than through tactical brilliance or individual excellence of units and commanders, making battles less dependent on quality of individual units or excellence of field commanders, and more dependent on systematic application of superior resources that could be provided consistently, rather than depending on exceptional performance that might vary across different units or situations. By accepting a slower operational tempo in exchange for higher certainty of success, Montgomery would be choosing an approach that minimized casualties while maximizing likelihood of achieving strategic objectives, reflecting Britain's need to preserve manpower while exploiting material advantages that could compensate for a slower pace of operations. By emphasizing careful planning and coordination rather than improvisation and exploitation of opportunities, Montgomery would be creating military operations that were more predictable and perhaps less flexible, but that were also more reliably successful and less vulnerable to the kind of tactical surprises or exploitation of mistakes that German forces had used to defeat previous British attacks. The strategic implications of facing Montgomery that Hitler emphasized in his warning to commanders extended beyond tactical considerations to affect how German forces would need to approach operations in theaters where British forces operated under Montgomery's command or influence. German forces would need to recognize that achieving tactical victories through operational brilliance and exploitation of enemy mistakes would be more difficult against Montgomery than against previous British commanders, who had been more willing to take risks or who had been more vulnerable to tactical provocations, that battles would be fought under conditions where British material superiority would be maximized through Montgomery's insistence on building overwhelming force before attacking, and that the kind of mobile warfare and aggressive maneuver that had characterized successful German operations would be more difficult to execute against British forces that would not be goaded into exposing vulnerabilities through tactical provocations or into launching premature attacks before preparations were complete. Most fundamentally, German forces would need to accept that defeating Montgomery would require either preventing him from achieving the material superiority he would insist on before attacking, which would require German forces to disrupt British logistics and reinforcement faster than Britain could deliver supplies and troops from its imperial resources and from American support, or would require developing defensive approaches that could impose such high costs on British attacks that even Montgomery's cautious approach and his emphasis on minimizing casualties would produce losses that British political leadership could not sustain without losing public support for continuing operations. Neither approach offered easy solutions. Disrupting British logistics required air and naval superiority that German forces did not possess in North Africa or in other theaters where British imperial lines of communication could be protected by the Royal Navy and by British air forces, while imposing prohibitive casualties on British attacks required defensive positions and force densities that German resource constraints and multi-front commitments made increasingly difficult to maintain.
But Hitler's warning about Montgomery also reflected the Führer's broader concerns about Germany's strategic position and about the challenges that would emerge as the war progressed from rapid German victories against enemies who could be defeated through operational excellence to prolonged struggles against enemies who possessed superior resources and who would eventually learn to neutralize German tactical advantages through systematic application of overwhelming force. Montgomery represented the kind of commander who would emerge in democratic nations when initial defeats forced reassessment of military approaches and when selection of commanders shifted from peacetime criteria, emphasizing seniority, political connections, or social background, to wartime criteria, emphasizing professional competence, ability to achieve results, and willingness to learn from defeats and adapt approaches based on battlefield experience. The fact that Britain had relieved previous commanders who had failed against Rommel and had appointed Montgomery despite his difficult personality, his lack of aristocratic connections, and his reputation for abrasiveness demonstrated that the British system was capable of learning from defeats and adapting command structures to meet wartime challenges. This adaptability represented a strength of democratic systems that Hitler's ideology prevented him from fully acknowledging. Democratic nations could replace failed commanders more readily than totalitarian systems, where loyalty to the regime and ideological commitment were valued alongside or above professional competence, could incorporate lessons from defeats into doctrine and training more systematically than systems where acknowledging failures might be politically dangerous, and could mobilize resources through voluntary cooperation and economic incentives rather than through compulsion that might be efficient in the short term, but that created inefficiencies and resistance over prolonged conflicts. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel and other senior officers present at the May 1942 briefing received Hitler's warning about Montgomery with reactions that mixed professional interest in understanding the new British commander with skepticism about whether British command changes would significantly affect campaign outcomes in North Africa or in other theaters where British forces operated. Some officers who had served in North Africa or who had studied Rommel's campaigns were inclined to dismiss British command capabilities regardless of who held command positions, arguing that British forces had demonstrated systematic weaknesses in combined arms coordination, in tactical flexibility and initiative at lower command levels, and inability to respond rapidly to changing battlefield conditions that would persist regardless of changes in senior leadership, because these weaknesses reflected broader characteristics of British military culture and training rather than just failings of individual commanders. Others recognized that Hitler's analysis of Montgomery's approach had merit, and that facing a commander who would not repeat the mistakes of previous British generals might indeed require different German tactical and operational approaches, but questioned whether a systematic and cautious commander would be effective in the North African environment, where rapid maneuver and exploitation of opportunities had proven decisive in previous campaigns, and where logistics limitations imposed by vast distances and harsh terrain made sustained attritional warfare difficult for both sides to maintain. The assumption among some German commanders was that the North African theater favored aggressive and flexible commanders who could exploit opportunities rapidly and who could adapt to fluid situations, and that Montgomery's systematic approach and emphasis on careful preparation might be ill-suited to a theater where situations changed rapidly and where success often depended on bold action rather than methodical planning. But the deeper skepticism among German commanders about Hitler's warning reflected broader patterns in how Wehrmacht leadership assessed enemies and in how German military culture valued different approaches to warfare that had been shaped by Germany's historical experiences and by doctrinal development that emphasized operational art and tactical excellence. German military culture emphasized operational brilliance and the ability to achieve decisive results through superior tactics and operational maneuver, tactical flexibility and initiative at all command levels through mission-type orders that gave subordinate commanders latitude to exploit opportunities and to adapt to changing situations without waiting for detailed instructions from higher command, and aggressive action that seized initiative from enemies and that imposed tempo and direction of operations rather than reacting to enemy moves. This cultural framework created a situation where systematic and cautious commanders like Montgomery were viewed as plotting and unimaginative rather than as representing a valid alternative approach to warfare that exploited different advantages and that addressed different strategic contexts. The victories that German forces had achieved in Poland, where operational excellence had defeated Polish forces in weeks, in France, where bold operational maneuver had achieved stunning victory against numerically superior Allied forces, and in early Eastern Front campaigns, where German tactical superiority had destroyed multiple Soviet armies, had reinforced conviction among German commanders that German operational excellence and tactical superiority could overcome material disadvantages, and that bold action and tactical brilliance were more important determinants of success than material superiority or systematic preparation.
This made it difficult for German commanders to accept that facing an enemy who emphasized material superiority over operational brilliance and who fought attritional warfare through systematic application of overwhelming resources might actually be more challenging in the long term than facing enemies who attempted to match German operational approaches, but who lacked the training, doctrine, and command culture to do so effectively. The assumption was that any enemy who accepted a slower operational tempo and who emphasized methodical preparation over rapid exploitation of opportunities was conceding initiative to German forces and was accepting a defensive posture that German tactical excellence could overcome, when in reality, Montgomery's approach represented a strategic choice to fight the kind of war that British advantages in resources and industrial capacity made winnable, even if individual battles lacked the operational brilliance or decisive tactical outcomes that German military culture valued. The First Battle of El Alamein in July 1942, which occurred shortly after Hitler's warning about Montgomery was delivered to German commanders, though before Montgomery had actually assumed command of Eighth Army, seemed initially to validate skepticism among some German officers about whether British command changes would significantly affect operational outcomes in North Africa. Rommel's forces advancing toward Cairo were stopped not primarily by British tactical excellence or by superior British operational planning, but by a combination of logistics exhaustion that left German forces unable to sustain offensive operations at the end of extended supply lines, stretching back hundreds of kilometers across the North African desert, by defensive advantages that British forces enjoyed defending prepared positions with interior lines of communication that allowed more efficient movement of reserves and supplies, and by accumulation of British reinforcements and material that created force ratios increasingly unfavorable to continued German offensive operations. But the Second Battle of El Alamein in October to November 1942, fought after Montgomery had assumed command of Eighth Army in August and had spent months rebuilding the force according to his systematic approach to preparing for offensive operations, demonstrated exactly what Hitler had warned about when describing Montgomery's capabilities and command style, and validated the Führer's assessment that Montgomery represented a different kind of threat than previous British commanders. Montgomery refused to attack until he had assembled overwhelming superiority in tanks, with British forces possessing over 1,000 tanks compared to German and Italian forces possessing fewer than 600 tanks, many of which were inferior Italian models, in artillery, where British superiority was even more pronounced, in aircraft, where British air forces achieved virtually complete air superiority that allowed British air attacks on German positions while preventing German air support, and in supplies, where British logistics provided adequate ammunition and fuel, while German forces operated under severe constraints. Montgomery spent weeks planning the offensive in meticulous detail, developing an operation plan that specified objectives for each phase, that allocated forces according to detailed calculations of requirements, and that coordinated infantry attacks to create breaches in German defensive positions with armor exploitation to expand breaches, and with artillery support that would suppress German defensive fire and destroy German defensive positions systematically.
The battle was conducted as a methodical reduction of German defensive positions through application of overwhelming firepower and through sustained pressure across multiple phases of operations, rather than as an attempt to achieve breakthrough through operational maneuver or through exploitation of tactical opportunities, exactly the approach that Hitler had predicted Montgomery would employ. The battle demonstrated Montgomery's strengths and limitations as a commander in ways that validated Hitler's assessment. The careful preparation and overwhelming force meant that British victory was virtually assured once the attack was launched, barring catastrophic errors in execution. The systematic coordination of different arms meant that British forces operated more effectively than in previous North African battles, where coordination failures had created vulnerabilities that Rommel had exploited. And the emphasis on maintaining pressure through multiple phases of operations prevented German forces from recovering and re-establishing defensive lines as they had done in previous battles when British attacks had been halted after achieving initial success. But the battle also revealed Montgomery's cautious approach and his reluctance to risk forces in pursuit operations that might have destroyed Rommel's forces more completely if British forces had pursued more aggressively after achieving breakthrough, with German forces being able to conduct a fighting withdrawal across North Africa rather than being encircled and destroyed, as might have occurred if British forces had accepted higher risks in the exploitation phase. The pattern that emerged in North Africa and that would characterize Montgomery's subsequent operations in the Sicily invasion, Italian campaign, and Northwest Europe campaigns from Normandy through Germany validated Hitler's assessment of Montgomery's capabilities and limitations as commander. Montgomery would achieve victories through systematic application of overwhelming force rather than through operational brilliance, would minimize British casualties by refusing to attack until conditions strongly favored success, would maintain pressure on German forces through sustained operations rather than through decisive battles aimed at complete destruction of enemy forces, and would represent an approach to warfare that exploited British resource advantages and that addressed British political constraints regarding casualties, while accepting a slower operational tempo and less decisive tactical outcomes than more aggressive commanders might attempt to achieve. These characteristics made Montgomery both an effective commander who could be relied upon to achieve assigned objectives with acceptable casualties and who could maintain force effectiveness through professional competence and thorough preparation, and a limited commander who was unlikely to achieve the kind of decisive victories or bold operational maneuvers that might have shortened the war significantly, or that might have achieved strategic objectives at lower overall cost in time and resources. The debate about Montgomery's effectiveness would continue through the war and into post-war historical analysis, with some arguing that his cautious approach prolonged campaigns unnecessarily and missed opportunities for more decisive results, while others argued that his emphasis on minimizing casualties and on achieving certain success was appropriate given British strategic constraints and political realities. When Hitler warned his generals about Montgomery, he was providing an accurate assessment of a formidable opponent whose command style and strategic approach represented a serious threat to German forces. But the warning was not accompanied by strategic adjustments that might have addressed the fundamental challenges that Montgomery's approach exposed in Germany's strategic position. German commanders received the warning. Many dismissed it based on confidence in German tactical superiority, and those who recognized its accuracy found that acknowledging Montgomery's capabilities did not provide solutions to strategic problems that his systematic attritional approach created for German forces operating with declining resources against enemies whose material advantages were growing progressively larger as the war continued.